London, September 1858. The rain fell in steady grey curtains over Bloomsbury, turning the cobblestones into dark mirrors that reflected a world Harriet Adelaide Thornberry had learned to navigate with quiet resignation. At 42, she had become a woman the world no longer saw, not with cruelty, but with something far worse: indifference. She walked alone through the damp streets, her modest grey pelisse darkened at the shoulders, her bonnet shielding a face that had never been called beautiful, even in youth. Plain, her mother had said. Serviceable, her late husband had added, as though she were a reliable piece of furniture. Now, 8 years widowed and living on a parson's meager pension, Harriet had accepted her place in society's margins. She attended few events, kept few friends, and asked for nothing. Yet every Thursday, she allowed herself one small luxury: the lending library on Great Russell Street, where leather-bound volumes offered her what living company no longer could: substance, beauty, conversation without condescension. The bell chimed softly as she entered, shaking droplets from her umbrella. The familiar scent of aging paper and beeswax enveloped her like an old friend's embrace. Mrs. Pemberton, the librarian, nodded absently from her desk, already turning back to her ledger. Harriet moved through the narrow aisles with practiced efficiency, her fingers trailing along spines until they found the poetry section. There, Wordsworth's latest collection. She reached for it just as another hand appeared, larger, unmistakably masculine, extending toward the same volume. "Forgive me," a voice said, low and warm. "I believe we've had the same thought." Harriet withdrew her hand quickly, heat rising to her cheeks. "Please," she murmured, stepping back. "I can return another day." But the gentleman, tall, with silver threading through dark hair at his temples, lines of character marking a face that spoke of lived experience, did not take the book. Instead, he regarded her with an expression she had not seen directed at her in years: genuine interest. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we might share it? I confess I'm particularly interested in his reflections on solitude and age. If you've read the collection, I should very much value your thoughts." Harriet blinked, uncertain whether this was politeness or something more dangerous. Pity, perhaps. But his eyes, gray as the rain outside, held no condescension. Only a quiet loneliness that mirrored her own. "I have not yet read it," she admitted, "though I confess the same themes drew me. There is something honest in acknowledging that life does not end at 30, even if society suggests otherwise." A smile touched his lips, transforming his somewhat austere features. "Indeed, though I would argue that life scarcely begins before 40. Everything prior is merely rehearsal." And so they stood in that narrow aisle, the rain drumming against the windows, and talked. Not of weather or trivialities, but of Wordsworth's treatment of memory and loss, of how poetry could articulate what polite conversation forbade, of the peculiar isolation that comes not from being alone, but from being overlooked in crowded rooms. Nearly an hour passed before Mrs. Pemberton's pointed cough reminded them that the library would soon close. The gentlemen, they had not exchanged names, Harriet realized, and somehow that made the conversation feel even more precious, unanchored from society's rules, bowed slightly. "This has been the most stimulating conversation I've had in months," he said, and Harriet heard the truth beneath the courtesy. "I hope we might encounter each other again." "Perhaps," Harriet replied, allowing herself the smallest smile. "Thursday afternoons seem fortuitous." She walked home through the rain with something unfamiliar warming her chest. Not hope, exactly, for she had learned the danger of that particular emotion, but a small flicker of something that felt almost like it. The following week brought an invitation that Harriet would have declined. had Mrs. Dorothy Blackwell not appeared at her door with the look of a general preparing for battle. "You cannot refuse," Dorothy declared, sweeping into Harriet's modest sitting room with the authority of 65 years and a complete disregard for social timidity. "It's a charity tea for the orphan asylum. Perfectly respectable, and I require your company." "Dorothy, you know perfectly well I'm only invited because I make the other women feel younger and more relevant by comparison," Harriet said, though without bitterness. It was simply fact. "All the more reason to attend," Dorothy replied crisply. "Let them feel superior while we actually accomplish something useful. Besides, you cannot spend every day hiding in your books, dear as they are." And so Harriet found herself, one gray afternoon, standing in the manicured gardens of Lady Ashworth's Mayfair townhouse, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands, and the familiar weight of invisibility settling over her shoulders like a well-worn shawl. She had positioned herself near the refreshment table, always a safe location, as it provided both occupation and excuse to avoid conversation. Around her, younger women in fashionable crinolines chattered and laughed, their voices bright as birds. No one addressed her directly, though several nodded politely in passing, their eyes sliding away as though she were part of the furniture. Harriet was reaching for the lemonade when she heard them. 3 voices just beyond the hedge, clear as crystal and sharp as glass. Good heavens! Is that Mrs. Thornberry, still attending these events as though she were a debutante? I suppose someone should tell her it's rather tragic. At her age, one ought to accept invisibility with grace. Lady Cordelia Pemberton's distinctive laugh, high and cutting. Perhaps she's forgotten how old she is. Someone should kindly remind her that 42 is hardly the age for, well, for anything, really. The other women tittered. Harriet's hand froze on the lemonade ladle. "It's the desperation that's so awkward," another voice added, "as though pretending to still be relevant will make it so." Harriet carefully set down the ladle, her hands steady despite the way her chest had constricted. She had heard such things before, felt such dismissals 1,000 times, but the casual cruelty never quite lost its sting. The women moved away, still laughing, unaware or uncaring that their target stood mere feet away. "Harriet." Dorothy appeared at her elbow, face set in furious lines. "You heard them." "It hardly matters," Harriet said quietly, though her voice betrayed the lie. "It matters greatly," Dorothy said fiercely, gripping Harriet's arm. "Their cruelty speaks of their own emptiness, their own terror of becoming what they mock. They ridicule you because you remind them of their future, and they cannot bear it." "Perhaps they're right," Harriet whispered. "Perhaps I should simply accept." "Accept nothing," Dorothy interrupted, her voice steel beneath velvet. "You are worth 10 of that vapid girl and her chorus of fools. Do not let them convince you otherwise." But as Harriet walked home through the lengthening shadows, Dorothy's words could not quite dispel the deeper truth settling in her bones. Perhaps it was time to stop pretending. Time to accept that her life, such as it was, would be lived in the margins until it ended altogether. Yet when she reached her small house and lit the lamp in her sitting room, her gaze fell on the Wordsworth volume resting on the side table, borrowed at last from the library, and she remembered gray eyes that had actually seen her, a conversation that had treated her as though her thoughts mattered. She opened the book to a marked page where a line leapt out at her. "What we have loved, others will love, and we will teach them how." The small flame of defiance flickered but did not die. Harriet did not return to the library the following Thursday, nor the Thursday after that. The humiliation at Lady Ashworth's garden had burrowed deep, and she found herself unable to risk another encounter where hope might be mistaken for desperation. Better to remain home, where expectations were low and disappointments scarce. But on the 3rd Thursday, Dorothy appeared at her door again, this time with less patience and more fire. "You are coming with me to the library," she announced, brooking no argument. "You cannot allow those shallow creatures to steal your one pleasure." "I'm not hiding," Harriet protested weakly. "You are absolutely hiding, and poorly at that." Dorothy adjusted her bonnet with the air of someone preparing for battle. "Now fetch your shawl. We're going." The afternoon sun broke through London's perpetual haze as they walked, and Harriet felt her resistance crumbling with each step. She had missed the library, missed the quiet sanctuary it provided, missed the possibility, however small, of Thursday afternoons. Dorothy deposited her at the door with a knowing look. "I have business at the draper's. Take your time." The bell chimed. Mrs. Pemberton glanced up and smiled, a real smile this time. "Mrs. Thornberry, a gentleman was asking after you just last week. Seemed quite disappointed not to find you here." Harriet's heart performed an alarming flutter. Was he? "Indeed. He's here now, in fact. Poetry section." Harriet moved through the aisles as though drawn by invisible thread, and there he was, the gentleman from 3 weeks prior, silver-touched hair catching the light from the high windows. He stood reading, absorbed, and she nearly turned back, suddenly conscious of her plain day dress and the gray in her own hair, pinned severely back. But he looked up, and his entire countenance transformed. "You came back," he said, and the relief in his voice was so genuine that Harriet's carefully constructed walls trembled. "I had feared my company that afternoon was somehow offensive." "Not at all," Harriet replied quickly. "I merely... life became complicated." He set down his book, giving her his full attention in a way that made her feel simultaneously visible and vulnerable. "I'm glad life has simplified then. I confess I've missed our conversation. It's rare to find someone who understands that poetry is not mere ornament, but necessary sustenance." They fell into discussion as easily as before, though Harriet was acutely aware that they still had not exchanged names, a peculiar intimacy and distance existing simultaneously. They spoke of Coleridge and Keats, of whether beauty required youth or whether it deepened with understanding. He argued passionately for the latter. She found herself agreeing with a fervor that surprised her. Finally, as the afternoon light began to slant golden through the windows, he cleared his throat. "Forgive me, but I feel we've moved beyond the bounds of anonymous acquaintance. I am Edmund Ashford, Marquess of Westmere." He paused, watching her face. "And I would very much like to know your name." Harriet felt the floor tilt slightly. Marquess. Of course he was titled wealthy, impossibly above her station. The brief, bright thing that had been growing in her chest withered instantly. "Mrs. Harriet Thornberry," she managed, her voice small. "Widow of the late Reverend Thomas Thornberry." She waited for it, the subtle shift in his expression, the polite withdrawal. Men of his rank did not pursue friendships with impoverished widows of country parsons. Their conversations had been an aberration, a brief escape from reality that must now end. But Lord Westmere simply smiled. "Mrs. Thornberry, the name suits you, strong and unpretentious." He hesitated, then added carefully, "I wonder if I might call upon you. Properly, I mean. I find I am quite starved for intelligent conversation, and you are the only person in London who has not once mentioned my title or my late wife's family connections." "You cannot mean to—" Harriet stopped, flustered. "My lord, I live in Bloomsbury. Very modestly. I'm hardly—" "I mean," he interrupted gently, "to continue our conversations, if you'll allow it. Unless you find the prospect unwelcome?" His eyes held uncertainty that matched her own, and Harriet realized with shock that he feared her rejection. She, who had nothing, refusing him, who had everything. "I would like that," she whispered. Very much. And so began a peculiar autumn. Lord Westmere, Edmund, as he insisted she call him when they were alone, visited her small house twice weekly. They took tea in her modest sitting room, where he sat in her late husband's worn armchair and discussed philosophy and literature as though they were equals. He never remarked on her simple furnishings or the threadbare carpet. He brought books from his library for her to borrow, carefully selected to match their conversations. He spoke, gradually, of his own loneliness. His marriage, arranged in his youth, had been cold and dutiful. His late wife had viewed him as a title and a fortune, never as a man. They had produced one child, a daughter, Margaret, now 22, but little affection. I swore after she died that I would never again seek companionship where it was not genuine, he told Harriet one October afternoon, his voice quiet. Better to be alone than to be seen merely as a convenience. I understand that, Harriet replied, thinking of her own marriage. Kind but passionless, a union of shared duty rather than shared souls. My husband was a good man, but we were more companions than lovers. Sometimes I wonder if I missed something essential by never knowing more. Their eyes met, and something sparked between them that neither named, but both felt. When Edmund invited her to dinner at his Mayfair residence, Harriet almost refused. But Dorothy, upon hearing the invitation, practically pushed her out the door. If you decline this, I shall disown you as a friend. The man is clearly smitten. He's being kind, Harriet protested. Perhaps he pities... Harriet Adelaide Thornbury, if you finish that sentence, I shall scream. Dorothy fixed her with a fierce look. Men do not spend hours in uncomfortable furniture reading poetry with women they pity. Now go. Wear your blue dress. And for heaven's sake, allow yourself to believe you might be wanted. The evening at Edmund's home was elegant, but not ostentatious. A private dinner in his library rather than the formal dining room. But it was not private. His daughter Margaret attended, and from the moment Harriet entered, she felt the young woman's measuring gaze. Margaret was beautiful in the way Harriet had never been. Fair and fine-boned, with her father's gray eyes but none of his warmth. She was polite, impeccably so, but her every word carried subtle weight. How lovely that father has found a companion for intellectual discourse, Margaret said over the first course, her tone perfectly modulated. He does so tire of society's superficial conversations. Though of course, at certain ages, one appreciates depth over frivolity. Margaret, Edmund said quietly, a warning in his voice. I merely mean that maturity brings wisdom, Margaret continued, smiling at Harriet with cool courtesy. Society does place such unfortunate emphasis on youth, when experience is far more valuable. Don't you agree, Mrs. Thornbury? I believe both have their place, Harriet replied carefully, understanding the unspoken message. You are old. My father deserves someone younger, someone suitable. The evening concluded cordially but without warmth, and as Edmund escorted Harriet to her carriage, he apologized. Margaret is protective, he said. Her mother's death was difficult, and she worries about fortune hunters. I understand, Harriet replied, though the words stung. Of course Margaret would think that. What else could explain her father's interest in an impoverished, aging widow? Do you? Edmund's hand caught hers, a brief touch that sent heat racing through her. Because I'm not certain I do. I only know that when I'm with you, I feel more myself than I have in decades. Harriet fled before she could do something foolish, like believe him. The following week brought an invitation to a musical recital at the home of Baron Hartley. Edmund sent a note asking if she would attend as his guest, and despite every reasonable instinct screaming refusal, Harriet accepted. She should have known better. Lady Cordelia Pemberton descended the moment Harriet entered the drawing room, resplendent in rose silk and malicious intent. "Mrs. Thornberry, what a surprise to see you here." Her voice carried, turning heads. "I had thought you preferred quieter pursuits these days. More age-appropriate activities." Edmund appeared at Harriet's elbow, his jaw tight. "Lady Cordelia." "Lord Westmere." Cordelia's hand found his arm with practiced ease, her fingers curling possessively. "I've been hoping to speak with you about the charity committee. We desperately need someone of your stature and—" Her eyes flickered to Harriet. "Someone appropriate to lead our efforts." Throughout the evening, Cordelia maneuvered with ruthless precision, separating Edmund from Harriet at every turn, making pointed comments about generational differences, and maintaining certain standards. Other guests watched with varying degrees of amusement and pity, and Harriet felt herself shrinking, becoming invisible again. During the musical performance, seated in the back row while Edmund was positioned prominently in front beside Cordelia, Harriet made her decision. This had been foolish, allowing herself to hope, to imagine that a man like Edmund could genuinely want someone like her. She would end it kindly, return to her quiet life, and let him find someone suitable, someone young and beautiful who would not embarrass him. At the interval, she slipped into the garden, needing air and solitude before she could face the remainder of the evening. The night was cool, stars visible despite London's haze, and she found a secluded bench behind a hedge of roses. There, finally alone, Harriet allowed the tears to come. Not dramatic sobs, but the quiet weeping of someone who had dared to hope, and now must relinquish that dangerous emotion. She had been a fool. At 42, she should know better. "Harriet!" She startled, looking up to find Edmund standing before her, his face stricken. He must have followed her. "Please," she said quickly, wiping at her eyes. "I'm perfectly well. I merely needed air." "Don't." He knelt before her, heedless of his fine evening clothes on the damp grass, and took her hands in his. "Don't pretend with me. Not you." "I should return inside," Harriet whispered, but made no move to rise. "They are fools," Edmund said fiercely. "All of them. Fools who cannot see what stands before them. A woman of intelligence, grace, and rare depth. They mock you because they cannot comprehend that value exists beyond youth and conventional beauty." "Edmund, no, let me finish." His grip tightened. "I have spent 5 years in a gray fog, performing my duties, maintaining appearances, utterly alone despite being constantly surrounded. Then I met you, and suddenly the world had color again. Your thoughts, your humor, the way you see directly to the heart of things. I have never felt this with anyone. Not even close." Harriet's breath caught. "You cannot mean—" "I am entirely in earnest." His eyes searched hers desperately. "I understand if you do not feel the same, but please don't withdraw from me because of their cruelty. Don't let them steal this." "I'm afraid," Harriet admitted, the words breaking free. "Afraid of being ridiculous. Afraid that you'll wake one morning and realize I'm just a plain, aging widow who has nothing to offer a man of your station. Afraid that I want this too much to see clearly." Edmund's hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "You are the least ridiculous person I know, and you see more clearly than anyone. But I understand fear. I've lived with it for years." He paused, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "I'm afraid too, Harriet. Afraid you'll never believe you're worthy of being loved." The word hung between them. Love. Unspoken yet undeniable. They sat in the garden as the music swelled inside, neither quite ready to name what was growing between them, but no longer able to deny its existence. Edmund helped her to her feet, and they returned inside together, his hand at the small of her back, a declaration that anyone watching would recognize. Lady Cordelia's expression, when she saw them, could have curdled milk. But 3 days later, Margaret Ashford appeared at Harriet's door. The young woman stood on the threshold, her posture perfect and her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Thornberry, I hope I am not intruding. I wanted to speak with you, privately." Harriet invited her in, her heart sinking. She knew what was coming, the polite but firm request to cease seeing Edmund, to accept reality, to stop making a spectacle. Margaret accepted tea but did not drink it. Instead, she studied Harriet with unsettling directness. "My father is happier than I have seen him in years," Margaret said finally. "Perhaps ever. He smiles now. He whistles while reading. It's quite disconcerting." "I'm glad he's happy," Harriet replied carefully. "Are you?" Margaret's gray eyes, so like Edmund's but harder, fixed on her. "Because I must be frank, Mrs. Thornberry. My father is 47. He could have years ahead of him. He deserves someone who can give him those years, someone with vitality and more time." The words struck precisely where they were aimed. Harriet set down her teacup with shaking hands. "You're right, of course," she said quietly. "I've known from the beginning that this was unsuitable. I'll speak with him. I'll make it clear that—" "I didn't say you should stop seeing him," Margaret interrupted, then frowned. "Actually, I did say that, didn't I? 3 weeks ago, to myself, repeatedly." She stood abruptly, moving to the window. "But then I found something. My mother's diary, hidden in her dressing room. I was looking for jewelry and found truth instead." She turned back to Harriet, and her perfect composure cracked slightly. She wrote about how empty their marriage was, how my father tried for years to connect with her, and she simply couldn't be bothered. She saw him as a title, a home, a means to social position. She wrote that she pitied him, his romanticism, his foolish need for affection. Margaret's voice hardened. She called him foolish for wanting love. Harriet said nothing, her throat too tight for words. "I realized I've never seen my father truly happy," Margaret continued. "Content, yes. Dutiful, certainly. But happy? Actually joyful?" She shook her head. "Not until you. And I came here to tell you to leave him alone, to protect him. But now—" She sat again, suddenly looking younger than her 22 years. "Now I think perhaps I've been protecting him from the wrong thing. Perhaps the real cruelty would be denying him this chance. Margaret—" "I'm not asking you to promise anything," Margaret said quickly. "I'm not even saying I'm entirely comfortable with this. But I am saying, don't make decisions for him based on what you think he deserves. Let him decide what he wants. Give him that respect." After she left, Harriet sat in her quiet sitting room for a long time, Margaret's words echoing in her mind. The afternoon light faded to dusk, and still she sat, turning over possibilities she had been too afraid to fully imagine. When the knock came at her door near evening, she knew before opening it who would be there. Edmund stood on her threshold, letter in hand, his expression uncertain. "I've done something either very brave or very foolish," he said without preamble. "I've invited you to Ashford Park, my estate in Kent, for a weekend house party. Very proper, several guests, Margaret as chaperone. But Harriet—" He stepped closer. "I need you to know this isn't simply friendly. I'm courting you, openly, and if you come, everyone will know it." Harriet's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment, the choice between safety and terrifying possibility. "If I come," she said slowly, "they will mock you, call you eccentric or worse. Lady Cordelia will—" "Lady Cordelia can go to the devil," Edmund said flatly. "As can anyone who cannot see what I see. The only opinion that matters is yours. So I'm asking, Harriet, will you come?" She thought of Dorothy's fierce words, of Margaret's unexpected blessing, of gray eyes in a library that had seen her when no one else had. "Yes," Harriet whispered. "Yes, I'll come." Edmund's smile could have lit all of London. Ashford Park rose from the Kent countryside like something from a novel. Golden stone glowing in the autumn sun, surrounded by ancient oaks just beginning to turn bronze and amber. Harriet stepped from the carriage feeling utterly out of place, her simple traveling dress painfully modest compared to the elegance before her. But Edmund was there, hand extended, eyes bright with welcome. "You came," he said, as though he'd feared she might flee at the last moment. "I'm so very glad." The house party was small, only 8 guests beyond Margaret and Harriet herself. Mrs. Blackwell had been invited as Harriet's companion, a bit of respectability that made Dorothy cackle with delight. "Finally, my scandalous reputation proves useful," she'd declared during the journey. But the gathering also included Lord and Lady Hartley, Baron Somerville and his sister, and, Harriet's stomach sank, Lady Cordelia Pemberton with her widowed father as chaperone. Cordelia's presence was a deliberate gauntlet thrown, and everyone knew it. That first evening passed in careful politeness. Dinner was elegant, conversation appropriately refined, and if Lady Cordelia monopolized Edmund's attention with practiced skill, well, Harriet had expected nothing less. She sat at the far end of the table beside Baron Somerville, discussing agricultural improvements with determined cheerfulness, while her heart performed acrobatics each time Edmund's gaze found hers across the candlelight. After dinner, while the ladies took tea in the drawing room, Cordelia struck with surgical precision. "Such a lovely home," she purred, positioned prominently on the sofa. "It requires a certain type of woman to manage an estate of this significance. Don't you think, Lady Hartley? Someone with energy and social standing to handle the demands." "Indeed," Lady Hartley replied, oblivious to the undercurrent. "The Marchioness of Westmere has significant responsibilities." "Precisely." Cordelia's eyes flickered to Harriet, sitting quietly by the window with her teacup. "One would need years of experience in society, extensive connections, and of course," her smile turned sharp, "the stamina to manage such a large household and entertain appropriately." "I imagine love and compatibility matter more than stamina," Margaret said suddenly from her position near the fire. Her voice was cool, but color rode high on her cheeks. "My mother had all those qualifications you mentioned, Lady Cordelia. She was utterly miserable here, and made everyone around her miserable as well." The room fell silent. Cordelia recovered quickly, laughing lightly. "My dear Miss Ashford, I certainly didn't mean to suggest—" "I think you meant exactly what you suggested," Margaret interrupted, setting down her teacup with enough force to make it rattle. "And I think we're all tired of pretending otherwise. If you'll excuse me, I find I need air." She swept from the room, leaving stunned silence in her wake. Harriet rose to follow, but Dorothy's hand caught her wrist. "Let her go," the older woman whispered. "That girl just declared herself your ally. Give her a moment to feel proud of it." Harriet sank back into her chair, shaking. Across the room, Cordelia's perfect mask had slipped, revealing ugly fury beneath. The following morning brought rain, heavy sheets that drummed against the windows and kept everyone trapped indoors. Edmund suggested the library for those interested, and Harriet escaped there gratefully, leaving the others to cards and gossip in the drawing room. She was reading when Margaret entered, hesitancy replacing her usual confidence. "That was quite the speech last night," Harriet said gently. "Thank you, but you needn't have—" "Yes, I did." Margaret sat beside her. "I've been thinking about what my mother wrote, about how she wasted her life being miserable because she couldn't see past society's expectations to what actually mattered." She looked directly at Harriet. "I don't want to become her." and I don't want to be the reason my father ends up alone. Margaret, let me finish, please. The young woman twisted her hands in her lap. This is strange for me. You're older than father, and that's unusual. But he's happier with you than he's ever been. Isn't that what matters? Not what society thinks, but whether two people make each other's lives better? Harriet felt tears prick her eyes. You're very wise for 22. I'm terrified, Margaret admitted. But I think perhaps that's good. It means I'm choosing something real over something safe. She managed a small smile. Rather like father, I suppose. That evening, Edmund announced that despite the weather, there would be a formal dinner. In celebration, he said, his eyes never leaving Harriet's face, of honesty and new beginnings. Harriet dressed with Dorothy's help, her finest gown, deep blue silk that had been expensive 6 years ago and was now slightly out of fashion, the best she could offer. Dorothy pinned her graying hair in an elegant chignon and squeezed her shoulders. Whatever happens tonight, Dorothy said firmly, remember that you deserve every bit of happiness that comes your way. The dining room at Ashford Park was magnificent, all crystal and candlelight, the long table set with family silver. Harriet found herself seated midway down, between Baron Somerville and Lord Hartley, a respectable but unremarkable position. Edmund sat at the head in formal evening dress, Margaret to his right, and Lady Cordelia to his left. Throughout the first courses, Cordelia performed magnificently, charming the table with witty anecdotes and subtle reminders of her suitability. Harriet focused on her plate and tried not to feel her courage draining away. But as the final course was cleared and dessert wine poured, Edmund stood. The table fell silent. "Forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying despite its quietness. "But there's something I must say, and I find I can no longer wait for the appropriate moment." He moved from his position at the head of the table, walking slowly past the startled guests until he stood beside Harriet's chair. She looked up at him, heart pounding so violently she was certain everyone could hear it. And then Edmund knelt. The gasps around the table were audible. Cordelia's face went white, then red. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes bright. "Harriet Adelaide Thornberry," Edmund said, taking her trembling hand in both of his. "I have spent 47 years on this earth. I married once, as was expected, and lived for 20 years in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife and felt absolutely nothing. I resigned myself to duty over joy, responsibility over passion. I believed that was simply the nature of life, that the poets lied, and romantic love was fiction." His voice strengthened, and he looked only at her. "Then I met you in a library, reaching for the same book of poetry, and you spoke to me as though I were simply a man rather than a title. You made me laugh, you made me think, you made me feel, for the first time in decades, fully alive." Harriet couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at this extraordinary man kneeling before her. "I know what they say," Edmund continued, "that you're too old, too plain, too poor, too inappropriate. But here is what I know to be true. You are the most intelligent, compassionate, beautiful woman I have ever known. You see the world with clarity and kindness. You have survived dismissal and cruelty with grace, and I love you. Utterly, completely, without reservation." A tear escaped down Harriet's cheek. Edmund reached up gently to wipe it away. "I don't care what they think," he said. "I care what you think. So I'm asking here before witnesses, with my whole heart, will you marry me? Will you let me spend whatever years we have left proving that love has no age limit, no expiration date, no rules except the ones we make together?" The silence in the room was absolute. Harriet was aware of Cordelia's shocked fury, of Margaret's encouraging nod, of Dorothy's fierce pride, but mostly she was aware of Edmund's eyes, gray as rain, warm as summer, looking at her as though she hung the moon. She had spent 8 years invisible, a lifetime being told she was insufficient, 42 years learning to expect nothing. And here was a man offering her everything. "Yes," Harriet whispered, then louder, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, Edmund, yes." He surged to his feet and pulled her up with him, and before the entire scandalized, delighted, shocked assembly, he kissed her. Not a polite kiss, but a kiss that spoke of years of loneliness ended, of two souls finally finding home. When they broke apart, the room erupted. Margaret was crying openly, applauding. Dorothy cheered with unladylike enthusiasm. Lord and Lady Hartley exchanged bewildered glances but managed polite applause. And Lady Cordelia Pemberton stood abruptly and swept from the room without a word. No one particularly cared. Edmund kept Harriet's hand in his as he addressed the table. "I hope you'll all join me in celebrating. I've waited 47 years to find someone who makes me believe in love, and I intend to spend every day remaining proving myself worthy of that gift." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and champagne. Margaret embraced Harriet tightly, whispering, "Thank you for making him happy. Thank you for being brave enough to say yes." Later, when the other guests had retired, Edmund and Harriet walked through the conservatory, the rain still drumming steadily against the glass roof. "Are you certain?" Harriet asked, needing to hear it once more without an audience. "Truly certain? Because once we announce this formally, there's no turning back. Society will gossip and judge, and eventually find something else to discuss," Edmund interrupted gently. He pulled her close, his arms around her waist. "Harriet, I have lived my entire life according to society's rules. I married appropriately, behaved appropriately, performed my duties appropriately. And I was profoundly, desperately unhappy. I refuse to sacrifice the rest of my life, our lives, to the opinions of people who cannot see past convention to recognize genuine connection." "I'm 42, Harriet said, voicing the fear that still haunted her. "I'll be 43 soon, then 50, and I'll be 55, then 60, then hopefully ancient and cantankerous," Edmund replied, smiling. "We'll grow old together, Harriet. Isn't that precisely the point? To find someone you want beside you through all the years, not just the pretty ones?" She leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest, the steady beat of his heart. "I never imagined this, never let myself hope for something so extraordinary." "Then let's both practice hope," Edmund murmured against her hair. "Let's prove that life doesn't end at 40. Sometimes it finally begins." They married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the parish church near Ashford Park. Dorothy served as Harriet's witness, weeping copiously and without shame. Margaret stood beside her father, radiant in her role as his supporter. The guest list was intimate, those who genuinely celebrated the union rather than attended for spectacle. Lady Cordelia Pemberton received an invitation, as courtesy demanded. She did not attend. The wedding breakfast was held in Ashford Park's dining room, and as Harriet looked around the table at the small gathering of people who had supported them, she felt a profound sense of rightness settle into her bones. Edmund caught her eye across the table and smiled, that private smile that was hers alone. And she smiled back, no longer afraid to claim her happiness. That evening, as they stood together in the library that had become their sanctuary, Edmund pulled her close. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Terrified," Harriet admitted. "Overwhelmed, disbelieving, and yes, profoundly, impossibly happy." "Good." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, Finally, her lips. Because I intend to make you this happy every single day. That's quite an ambitious promise, my lord. I'm an ambitious man, my lady. He grinned. Besides, I have an advantage. I've spent 47 years learning what not to do in marriage. I'm quite determined to get it right this time. 3 months into their marriage, Harriet sat at the escritoire in her dressing room. Her dressing room in this magnificent house that was somehow now her home, writing a letter to Dorothy. She paused, looking out the window at the gardens below. Edmund walked there with his estate manager, discussing business, but he looked up as though sensing her gaze and waved. She waved back, smiling at the wonder of it all. The late autumn sun slanted through the window, gilding everything gold. In the distance, she could hear Margaret practicing piano. She had taken up music again, something she'd abandoned after her mother's death. The house felt alive, warm, full of possibility. Harriet thought of the woman she had been just months ago, resigned, invisible, certain her life had reached its conclusion. That woman would not recognize this one, standing in silk in a Marquess's home, loved and valued and seen. She thought of all the women like her former self, told they were too old, too plain, too much, or not enough. Women who believed their stories were over before they'd barely begun, and she knew with absolute certainty they were wrong. Society was wrong. Love had no age limit. Joy knew no calendar. And life, real, full, extraordinary life, could begin at any moment, if one was brave enough to reach for it. Edmund appeared in the doorway, slightly windblown from his walk. There you are. I've been looking everywhere. Come, I want to show you something. He led her downstairs and outside, to the conservatory where he'd proposed. There, in the center, stood a small lemon tree in a terracotta pot, its branches heavy with bright fruit despite the season. I had it brought from the greenhouse, Edmund explained, suddenly shy. It seemed fitting, something that bears fruit regardless of the time of year, that defies expectations about when things should bloom. He took her hand. Rather like us. Harriet looked at the tree, unexpected, out of season, thriving nonetheless, and laughed with pure delight. It's perfect. You're perfect, Edmund corrected, pulling her close. You're absolutely perfect. And standing there in the warm conservatory while winter approached outside, held in the arms of a man who saw her as she truly was, Harriet finally, completely believed him. The world had declared her too old for romance, too invisible for love, too far past her prime for happiness. The world, she had discovered, knew absolutely nothing.